Hi, very good morning to you. It's Dean from maverickstar Observatory. Over the coming next few days, you're going to be in a better position to understand exactly what it is I've been going on about for the last couple of days, and you're going to understand the severity. And if you're like me, I know your attention's already been drawn to one of the things that we're going to be discussing in this video, and you can see I've highlighted it. Almost all of Canada was covered by ice. Over the last 21,000 years, it was at its peak, and most of Canada was completely covered. But we're going to get onto that in a little bit. We're also going to have a look at how long it takes for just 100 parts per million to clear out the atmosphere, and what a futile effort it would be to even try and do something about it. In fact, guys, I'm pretty sure you're going to laugh about it when you see how long it actually takes for 100 parts per million to naturally be removed through natural processes out of our atmosphere. Before we get on, special thanks to Joseph, and thanks for the nice words that you put in your message along with your your donation to the observatory. You know, guys, we are still in a deficit. It is looking a little bit bleak whether we can clear that up by January. It would be nice if we could really make an effort and all pull together, because this advice is for everybody, and you might not be one of these people that are directly affected with this in the near future, but that means we shouldn't help others obtain the information. So, you know, if you are in a position to help support what we're doing here, and you do appreciate what we're trying to do, then why not support us? There's a link down there in the description. So this is what I was talking about then, getting back to, you know, almost all of Canada 21,000 years ago at the peak of the last glacial period was covered in ice. I just have a question for, you know, those people in Canada, being we're talking about Canada and other parts of the world which sit above 50 degrees latitude, which is most of the northern hemisphere. And if you think ice ages don't affect the southern hemisphere, they do, but we're going to look at what happens just for now over the next couple of days, what happens during an ice age over different regions of the northern hemisphere, and we're going to see exactly why it was that I was almost reluctant to talk and get into this subject, because what we could possibly be looking at is mass evacuations in the not too far coming future. And I've already showed you how close we are to this actually taking place. All the facts have been presented to you, so it's not a matter of if this is going to happen, it's just a matter of when it does and how prepared you're going to be. Now, if you live in Canada, I've got a question for you. Would you buy a house, say a £250,000 house, $250,000 house, if it was on a floodplain? What about if I tried to encourage you and give you a 10% discount, or even knock off $50,000 because this was something that was bothering you? Would you still buy that house in the floodplains? Or we could also ask the question, would you buy the house if it was situated adjacent to probably a volcano that hadn't erupted in the last 10,000 years? But according to, you know, people that study volcanoes, volcanologists, there is a possibility, even though it may be slim. Would you purchase that house? And the questions I've just asked you are really no different to the question is, would you at this particular time emigrate or migrate to a country which is possibly going to be covered with ice, and covered with ice for the next 50,000 years? You'd probably say to me, that sounds like a complete loss of money, and, you know, it's almost futile to think that you can thrive and survive in that region. Well, not everybody will decide on, when that time comes, evacuating places like Canada, but you can imagine now the scale of the events that are about to affect billions of people on this planet, and it certainly is going to happen without a doubt. There is no question about it. The history that we've got shows that this has happened many times before, and it will happen again. So just like buying a house on a floodplain, that house will flood at some point. Just like building a house next to a volcano, that volcano will erupt. And just like building a colony on a continent like Canada doesn't mean that the ice age won't happen again in that region. But just think about not just the loss of land or usable land or arable land that we can grow crops on. How do we get the logistics to regions that are covered in ice in such a bad way? Do we have icebreaker ships bringing container loads of provisions for Canada's residents? Or is it going to be simply the case for a mass evacuation? Not sure how far it extends back into the history, but I could probably have a safe bet by saying it wasn't very populated 500 years ago. And this is a mistake that the Vikings made on Greenland. They inhabited Greenland for no longer than probably 500 years, and when the temperature dropped gradually, they had to evacuate. And it's going to be no different in the future when this happens to those regions above 50 degrees latitude over the northern hemisphere. And we're talking about billions of people. And that's why I was saying, this is not something that we want to talk about lightly, especially when we know it is on the cards to happen at some point. Just imagine all the infrastructure in Canada right now having to cope with, continued sub-zero temperatures, continued snow blizzards as the ice sheets build up. It will be an effort that cannot be sustained. It will inevitably end up just like it did in Greenland for the Vikings years ago, an evacuation taking place. And these people were more resilient. These Vikings were much more resilient than the people in Canada. I'm not just picking on people in Canada, so please, my brothers and sisters in Canada, don't think that because I've singled you out here that I'm picking on you, because we're going to be talking about the rest of Europe and Russia very shortly in the coming days, and what is likely to be the effects of all this taking place. And like I said, you can see it is definitely taking place. Now we're going to go on to we're not just going to talk in this video about all the things that we know about it's going to happen. Like the grid is certainly going to be affected, and we know if a grid goes down how that affects people short term. Within 2 weeks they're fighting over food. Within a month they're killing people for food. This, we don't know how fast it can take place, but all I can say is I've showed you in yesterday's video 2 million square kilometres rebounded over the Arctic ice pack in less than 12 months. So how fast do you think it would be to begin to make the northern hemisphere look like it was in a glacial period? The facts is that we can't avoid it, and as human beings the only thing we can do is remove ourselves from those places. So if you live in Canada and you completely understand what I'm talking about and you want to do a little bit more research, you're going to find that I'm absolutely 100% right. There is no avoiding it, and therefore you need to make that next big decision, what you're going to do about it. But clearly you are going to be faced at a point in time where you're going to make a decision of whether you're going to take less money for your property now and relocate somewhere else, or you are going to have a complete loss. That's some of the things that you're going to have to think about. And if you are going to stay there, what is it going to look like after a couple of years of snow and ice are building up all around you? Can the government sustain continuity? And can it keep its people in even moderate comfort during this time? And the other thing is that you need to know is that glacial periods last tens of thousands of years. It might not even be, once it is fully recognised and understood, not even worth making those efforts to keep that continent colonised. So I want to move on. We're going to talk about other countries, we're going to talk about other events. Please put your thoughts down in the comment section, but I just want to show you this, because this is also as equally important. So what I've done here on the chart that we've been looking at over the last few days is just simply point out how long it takes for around 100 parts per million of CO2 to naturally be removed from the atmosphere. And you can see that gradually over the last 400 years, it's took longer and longer. We're at around 420 parts, 440 parts per million of CO2, and you can see that just it takes, the last time we went through an interglacial period, it took 100,000 years just to reduce over 100 parts per million. So we're at 400 parts per million. I'm sure the United Nations and other nations around the world that are talking about the subject of CO2 and climate change have, in their opinion, ways of removing CO2 out of the atmosphere, but we are never, ever going to be in a position where we can beat nature at a natural game. And therefore I ask the question, what is the point? What is the point in even trying when you're not going to see the benefits of whatever it is you do and how much you spend today for the next 100,000 years? If it takes 100,000 years to remove 100 parts per million, what then is the point in even talking about the subject of CO2? We want to drain every resource that we have right now to try and dent that 100 parts per million. Not going to happen. I know that people are laughing to some degrees, because I've seen what people have started to produce and invent, and we're talking huge like vacuum cleaners. But the problem is with these is that the filters can soon clog up with other elements in the atmosphere. You just can't remove one gas with these filters that they're attempting to do. And these things cost millions, and who do you think's paying for them? And if they know it's futile, like anyone would understand by looking at this chart, would know it's a complete waste of time to even try and manually remove that CO2 out of the atmosphere, when it takes so long and you're never going to see the benefits of it. The only reason you would therefore carry on and do that is to create jobs that don't need to be created, and invest money on projects that really don't benefit anybody. This is ridiculous that we are even having this conversation, and that world governments around the world seem to think that this is more important than real events that really could affect us at short term. And you're probably saying, well, Jen, you're talking a lot about CO2 at the moment and not so much about the magnetic pole reversal, but we are 17 months away from probably crossing a critical line with that. And all I will say is that the magnetic pole reversal, as well as the grand solar minimum, which is by some form of coincidence happening together, but they both produce the same results. First of all, the grand solar minimum reduces the solar output, which reduces the size of the heliosphere, which protects the whole of our solar system from outside radiation coming in. But then we have our primary shield affected by the weakened magnetosphere, and that protects us primarily from radiation, not just inbound from outside our solar system and our galaxy, but also protects us against the radiation that is emitted off the sun. And in turn, it produces effects which allow one of the most abundant greenhouse gases, which is never talked about, funnily enough, water, to condensate on these platforms, and therefore that modifies the jet streams. Now, this is setting up a perfect storm for us here on the northern hemisphere, because if we are waiting for snow to fall, then certainly by having more cosmic radiation in the jet streams, which are seeding platforms, then water will be able to condensate on those platforms, and these jet streams will carry it where it needs to be dropped, and that could be in the form of snow, not just rain. Over these northern latitudes where they get colder, and you have intermixing subtropical jet streams with polar jet streams, which bring up that warm, humid air and then suddenly freeze it over the northern hemisphere, you get snow falling, and snow falling in record numbers. So, a few things for us all to think about there, but I just wanted to point out how long it really takes for carbon dioxide to naturally come out the atmosphere. And as you can see, not only has time gone closer to the present day, it has also took longer for it to come out the atmosphere. And these are the things why I said I really didn't want to talk about it, because it's pretty dismal when you're looking at the events. But I suppose it is no different to just asking that question: do you want to build and buy a house on a floodplain? Do you want to build and buy a house next to a volcano? And it should be no different. Do you want to build a colony in a region which is affected by glaciation? Well, it might be fine if you're in that period, where you've lived in the house for 100 years and it hasn't flooded. But as we have seen recently on the news, houses that have never flooded before starting to flood, cities flooding that have never flooded in 100 years. We thought at that point it might be a safe bet to therefore build a little city there. But nature, just because it hasn't shown its true colours in a couple of 100 years, or in the case of a glaciation, 1,000 years, a couple of 1,000 years, 12,000 years, doesn't mean it's not going to recur, because as you can see, there has been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interglacial periods in the last 400,000 years, and that means there has been 6 or 5, and potentially the next one, glacial periods. And just look at the time scales that they last. The last 100,000 years, the one before that 80,000 years, the one before that 60,000 years, the one before that 55,000 years. These are long-term events, and that's why people migrated from one continent to the next, to avoid events such as these. We ain't got that luxury. And when millions of people at one time need to evacuate, there's a massive exodus of people coming out of countries. That is what's shortly known as a catastrophe. That's what we face, and it just so happens that we are in a time where our governments around the world are more convinced that they can do something about CO2. First of all, the CO2 ris as a natural occurrence and nothing to do with man, and you can see that on the chart I presented yesterday. Global warming, what they're talking about, didn't start in the 80s. It started 12,000 years ago at a period of time known scientifically as the Younger Dryas. And was the Industrial Revolution booming at that point 12,000 years ago? No, we're talking 300 years ago. There's no way we could have affected things 12,000 years ago with things that we'd started doing 300 years ago. You know that, I know that. What are the governments around the world actually doing, and why are they doing it? We have bigger events which affect us all and are more likely to occur than worrying about CO2 in our atmosphere, because right now CO2 makes up 0.4% of the atmospheric gases. That's how ridiculous this whole subject is. It's nothing. And when we look at exactly how much of that 0.4% of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, how much mankind has put in there, it becomes even more laughable. And everybody, if they had all the data in front of them, would say, why did the governments of the world even start this conversation? Well, I think it's because they rely on people being dumbed down and not informed. And is it a surprise that they go after observatories and channels like ours in the way they do? Even when there are qualified scientists talking about these events, and should be. Guys, there's a link down there if you want to help support what we're doing here. We're trying to keep people informed and probably save, them losing everything. There's a link there if you want to help support us, and we'll continue on this subject for the next few days. We'll look at other countries around the world and how they're affected, and we'll try and tally up how many people are likely to be affected by this event and or other events such as the magnetic pole reversal. So what I usually do. You take care of your loved ones, and as always, bye for now.